Annalyn, Swan and Mark Stevens are the author of a biography of Dutch-American artist Wilhelm de Koning. De Koning, an American master, was awarded various prizes, among them the 2005 Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Prize for Biography. Their latest work, Francis Bacon, Revelations, is the first biography of Francis Bacon to appear in 25 years and was published by Knopf earlier this year. Annalyn and Mark will be in conversation with Elaine Chelino, who has been based in Paris since 2002 and is a contributing writer and former Paris bureau chief for the New York Times. The author of several best-selling books, she published her latest book, The Seine, The River That Made Paris, with Norton last year. Chelino was decorated Chevalier of the Legion of Honor in 2010 for her special contribution to the friendship between France and the United States. Elaine, Annalyn, and Mark, thank you so much for being with us at the library this evening. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you, Alice. It's such a pleasure to be with you tonight. And it's an honor and a joy to be with Annalyn and Mark, whom I knew back in the early 1980s at Newsweek magazine. So 40 years of collegiality and friendship. It doesn't get any better than that. And so it's just, tonight is a great celebration of their incredible triumph. This book, the biography of Francis Bacon, is obviously a masterful work of art criticism. And Annalyn and Mark, from the time I first knew them when I was a kind of rough correspondent in the field, and they were these extraordinarily brilliant writers who peaufined, who polished prose even back then. It's brilliant writing. But in their 705 pages with 100 extra pages of footnotes, they trumped the three previous biographies that had been written by friends of Francis Bacon. And what they did with this book is, as Annalyn says, we were there to do the whole 9 yards. And they had to become sleuths and investigative reporters. So they blended their extraordinary writing and critical skills with, as Annalyn said in one of her presentations, boots on the ground, which was an old Newsweek magazine kind of phrase that you had to go there, you had to be present. So I wanted to start before, we have a wonderful surprise for you, this extraordinary slideshow where Annalyn and Mark will take us through Francis Bacon's life. But I wanted to start by asking a very direct journalistic question, which is, you became incredible reporters. You were sleuths. So tell me about the boots on the ground process. I mean, where did you go and what did you discover along the way?
What we discovered along the way was what everybody else who didn't put boots on the ground had missed. So the most amazing thing when Mark and I went into this Bacon project was that we discovered of the three previous biographers of Bacon, not one of them had gone to Ireland. Now, one of the key biographical factors in Francis Bacon's life is that he was Anglo-Irish. You know, it's a very particular culture. It's, you know, they were pretending, Mark always says, pretending into the 18th century culture lived on in the Anglo-Ireland, the Pale district. So we started, we began at the beginning. And then, you know, because Francis Bacon had such a wonderful far-flung life, he loved France, even bought a flat there in 1975 on the Rue de Barrague, went to the south of France right after the war. So France was a must for us. He loved gambling in Monte Carlo. Then from there, we sort of went to, you know, Italy because he loved Italy. And then we went to Spain because he loved Spain. And then finally, Tangier, which was critical in a certain sense at a certain part of his life with his then lover, the great love of his life, Peter Lacy. Without that, Elaine, you know, you're absolutely right. That's what brings life to a biography. You not only get the whole structure, but you can sink into the detail.
I would say that actually what we are is natural scavengers. You go around, it sounds very grand to be a scholar, but really what you do is you go and you scavenge in libraries. You find very elderly people who somehow remember little bits of an early life. You try to catch what can still be caught. And I think that's really the trick. It's not just investigative reporting, it's being open to serendipity and to place.
Well, isn't it also the idea that you have to learn to listen?
Yes, I mean, that's an old thing. You know that very well as a journalist. It's done a little bit differently, or it can be done in long biographies like this, which is there is a sort of, seduction is not the right word, but a friendship can develop between source and the writer. And very often people will not tell you immediately what they know until they trust you and until they know you better. So yes, in fact, Annalyn and I developed real friendships here. And also we made a point of trying to get to know people. So for purely selfish reasons, they would tell us what they really knew.
Also, patience is such a factor that we should mention, because it's kind of, when you go into one of these big projects, you're not going to get everybody's buy-in immediately. And I remember back to de Kooning, when we started that book, I can't tell you how many people said, oh, I'm going to write my own book. And you're looking at this person like Ernestine Lassaw, I remember, said this to me, and she was then in her 80s and never written anything before. And you have to say, oh, yes, of course. But, perhaps we can come back another time and, sort of talk, to talk through a few things with you. And over the course of time, as Mark says, you establish a trust. And some of these grand dames, let me tell you, in English society, because of course Francis Bacon was not only the sacred monster of Soho, but he also had a very socially upper class part of his life. And those grand dames, they took a long time to crack through with them in some cases.
Well, you go from the grand dames to, let's go to the grubby streets of Tangier, because Annalyn, I think you have one of your favorite stories. I mean, you even discovered that, is it the Tangier Times? Was that the newspaper that you found there?
Yes, and it changed its name along the way, but there was this one little local paper that played to the expat community. And I had to go to the American legation building in Tangier, putting on a headscarf, because I was going through the Soco Chico, and you have to be very careful when you do, wherever you go as a single woman, of course, in Tangier. And I showed up there, and for days, I would be going through the Tangier Times and, going, Eureka! Because they reported on Francis Bacon arriving, the young artist arriving from London. That was in 1956. And Francis Bacon's returning, and he has a great show coming up in Italy. Boy, oh boy, was that, one of the yes moments that we all know so well from our journalistic.
But of course, Tangier at that time was a kind of eccentric English village where you were allowed to do the things in public that you could only do in private in England. So it was an absolute deliciously mad society. And it was, as a result, great fun to go there. But that's part of what our project, our enterprise was in this book, was to bring to life different milieus that Bacon occupied. So Tangier was a very special place then. Very different from, of course, Soho, but related, very different from Paris, very different from the south of France. So bringing to life all these different places, plus all the secondary characters in his life that inhabited these places, is part of what makes a biography interesting and fun, more like a 19th century novel almost than just a biography.
The two of you are so extraordinary. You were married when I first met you. You are still married now. And I understand one of the first questions that you often get when you do an event from someone in the audience is, how does it work and how do you manage to stay married and at least ostensibly happily married when you have to work for so long on such an intense, deep project?
How rude of you, Elaine.
I'm curious because my husband is my best editor, and I dedicated my last book to him, and my first book and my last book I dedicated to him, only two of them. But I couldn't write side by side with him every day. I mean, confinement nearly drove me crazy because he was on the other side of the wall. So yes, I'm very curious for professional and personal reasons.
Well, we never write side by side. It's really about drafts and trying to perfect the story and understand what's going on. Isn't that right, Annalyn? You might disagree.
No, absolutely. I mean, you know, when you think about how much work goes into these big books, I think that we look at the other person as a wonderful, you know, confrere and lifeline, because it would be 20 years before you would do one of these books, particularly.
Actually, I don't agree with that. I think that if two people collaborate on a book, it actually takes twice as long.
Well, okay, everybody, you have to understand Mark. He has a very wry sense of humor. But
It does take longer for some reasons. But
I think that the trick here too, though, is if you're, we are so interested not just in sort of a biography per se, but creating a three-written narrative that's compelling on its own. And to do that, to tell a story to the best of your ability, to make the book transcend, you know, biography, as it were, that really takes a huge amount of work. And I'm not kidding about the time frame expanding, but we normally go through 6 or 7 drafts, complete drafts, when we write these books, just because that is what you have to do. You know, you have the facts, and then you have to turn them into a compelling narrative.
So you learn more and more as you go along. The longer you take, you have to revise your early views, because in fact, your perspective changes, and or it should, and deepens as you learn more and think more about the situation. So that requires going back again and again into what you've already done.
And what great example of this, I might add, which just came out of left field. We had walked the manuscript in all 1,100 at that point typed written pages into Knopf, and that was October of 2019. And then in 2020, suddenly some diaries that were really critical written by Diana Watson's cousin came to light. And we had to scramble. I mean, at that point, we were actually, the manuscript was in. And I remember this time last year being in Montana, staying up till 1 or 2 a.m. every night, revising 4 chapters on the basis of this kind of essential material that had.
Diana Watson was the cousin, by the way, not Diana Watson's cousin, but must be accurate here.
Oh, Francis Bacon's cousin, sorry, Diana Watson.
I think there's a great article to be written on the making of, or how to preserve a marriage. And on that note, I think this is a good moment for us to move from the very personal into your extraordinary slideshow and your presentation. What do you think, Alice?
I think that sounds fantastic. I'm going to share it. And Annalyn and Mark, how does that look from your end?
That's fine. We're doing this a little differently than we've done in the past. We're doing it very, very quickly, just a couple of sentences on each picture, and we'll see how that goes, very spontaneous. Here, the top picture is Bacon with his mother. He grew up in a very fancy, big house, Anglo-Irish situation, but he was, in fact, this photograph lies, because he was a desperately ill child, very ignored by his parents. They liked nothing better in that milieu than a horse, and he was allergic to horses. Down below, you see on the left, his fabulously rich and eccentric grandmother, who helped save his life by bringing him into society in a certain way. And to the right, you see his nanny, who had a working class, mischievous, down-to-earth perspective that also, in a way, saved his life in his early years. Next.
This is a portrait of Francis Bacon in about 1930. As you can see, he's beautiful. The first man who actually fell for Francis Bacon and with whom he lived for a while said of Francis Bacon, he's almost too pretty to be a boy. Next. This is a very interesting moment in Bacon's life, and one that he for years tried desperately to hide. This was the culmination of his early design career, came right out of his his 14 months in Paris, where he was in the art world, in the design world, much more than the art world. And this culminated in this design show of all of his own furniture, rugs, and paintings at 17 Queensberry Mews in Kensington in 1930. The rug on the floor is obviously Picasso is a big influence, but the most important influence was Madge Garland, this marvelous fashion editor of British Vogue, and who was fired at one point for being lesbian, went to Paris, had an entire world of design at her beck and call. And she basically paved the way for Bacon's this early design career. And right below that, you see one other early triumph, as it were, for Francis Bacon. 1933, Crucifixion, he painted. This was produced in a book across from a crucifixion by Pablo Picasso, no less. And it was bought by Sir Michael Sadler, one of the great collectors of the day. Everything indicated that Bacon was off and running to a brilliant career. And then he disappeared until the mid-40s. Next.
Bacon had a series of two older lovers early in his life, and this is the most important of the two. This is Eric Hall, who was a very significant, well-known London politician, a Tory, closeted, married with children, who fell madly in love with Bacon. And you can see it's by Roy de Maistre. It's a marvelous portrait. And you can see it's a portrait of a man with a hidden, concealed life. And the way you know that is you see how straight-laced he appears, but behind him, that flocked wallpaper, that velvet, luscious thing, that suggests that this man is a sensualist, a person who loves wine, food, and gambling, which is what he was at heart. Next.
This is a never before seen photo of the lodge at Bedale School in England. Francis Bacon, when England first entered World War II, volunteered to be in the Red Cross and then the Air Raid Precaution Service. However, once the Blitz came, he, of course, being terribly asthmatic, his lungs were pulverized. He was given a leave and spent 2 years out in the middle of nowhere, literally nowhere, 60 miles west of London on this huge but very isolated school campus in this house, the lodge. And it was here he looked at picture post magazines of all the snarling Nazi faces. He read Greek tragedies and his vision began, the famous Francis Bacon vision began to coalesce. Next.
This, of course, is the famous painting that most of you have probably seen, or Triptych, 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion. I could talk endlessly about this picture, but I'll just say that the central image is what is really disturbing about it, because that character with the bandaged head and the mouth, he's very familiar. He's like a nasty uncle who's sliding down towards you, talk to you at a family gathering, or a person on a bar stool. He's related to you. So the English in 1944 and 45, Bacon was saying, no, you can't just pretend it's the Germans or fascists. These people, the monster and the man, they know you. You're related too. Next. In this amazing picture called Head 1, you can see the head begin to slide off the traditional face of English portraiture. Again, there's an animal and a man quality to it, of course. And if you look at that line that's attached to the ear, that taut line, in the book we say that's the most abstract line in English art. You don't know what it's attached to, you don't know what it's doing, but it's releasing the face. Next.
This is one of the great characters in our book, Muriel Belter, who was the queen of the Colony Room Club that Bacon began frequenting as soon as it opened in 1949. This was the heart of the rabble-rousers of Soho. They all convened at her club. Muriel had an early and great instinct for what Bacon was going to become. She offered him 10 pounds and everything he could drink per week to bring in his friends. They became best of friends until her death in 1979. Muriel would sit by the door with this sort of rat-a-tat, sort of gun way of speaking, and her line would often be, out the door, cunty, and get a facelift on your way. Even the likes of Francis Bacon, someone once wrote, quailed before Muriel Belter's attacks. Next. This is the culmination of Bacon's early and probably most famous series of paintings, the Pope series of the early 50s. By 1953, when this was painted, the portrait of Pope Innocent X, it become quite grand. As you can see here, it's all the references back to sort of classical painting are there, but of course, in the way that Bacon turned everything topsy-turvy, what we have instead of a blessed face, we have somebody who, as we write in the book, looks like he's seen not the Lord on high, but the devil himself. And interesting, the construction of this painting, the dark striated lines that come down, rain down between the figure and that sort of echo of one of the gold chairs that the popes sit on. And you know, here Bacon is using one of those marvelous perspectives that he so often developed and perfected in his paintings. Next.
This is Peter Lacy, the love of Bacon's life. His life and his relationship to Bacon have been caricatured and are part of Bacon's persona, a sadomasochistic persona. Lacy would beat Bacon. It was just a desperate, horrible relationship. That's the way it's described or has been described. It had those elements. It was no doubt a tortured relationship. But these two guys, as we discovered, absolutely adored each other, and the relationship really only broke off with Lacy's death in 1962. They kept trying to get back together, kept trying. Lacy was also a very interesting character in his own right, and we spent a lot of time looking into his life. This is arguably the most difficult, but I don't think so, painting in Bacon's life. It's a wonderful painting. It's an iconic picture of homosexual love. There are many things to say about it, but I just point you to the expression on the face of the lower body, probably Bacon, where you have a combination of tenderness and ferocity, animal and human, that is absolutely extraordinary. This painting could not be exhibited when it was painted. And it came into the hands of Lucian Freud, a very heterosexual man, by the way, who placed it over his bed and kept it there until the end of his own life.
So this is Bacon in the aforementioned Tangier. Here he is with Joseph Dean, a very mysterious character, as indeed many of them were, who washed up there. Joseph Dean had this bar frequented by both the sort of aristocratic English who lived on what they called the mountain. It was actually just a big hill, and then everybody else. So Francis Bacon spent a lot of time here, and Peter Lacy played the piano in Joseph in the bar. Next.
This is, we include this because this is the most difficult painting that Bacon ever painted. It's called Crucifixion. It was the culmination of his 1962 retrospective, his first retrospective at the Tate. And again, there's lots of things to say about it, but maybe I'll just keep myself again to the central panel, which is, I think, probably the most difficult vision of human butchery that has ever been put to paint. However, the thing that's so disturbing about it is not just the facts, it's that there's a kind of delirious quality in the painting, which captures, I think, bloodlust. And so this is Bacon in three panels in different ways, addressing the darkness of the 20th century. Next.
May I add just a personal note here? At the Bacon retrospective in London, this is the only painting I could not look at. It is, as Mark says, it is so kind of violent, the force of it, it's hard to look at it.
This is Bacon's studio at Rhys Mews, his famous and legendarily messy studio. It's like a Cro-Magnon cave or something. It has it's just filled with rubbish, and you have the feeling that scholars could spend their entire life, indeed they have, pushing through the rubbish of decades here to find interesting little tidbits. He refused to live, you should also contrast this room with the room Annalyn described earlier. He was originally trying to make a new kind of room for Western society. Here he says, this is what the room of Western society has become.
So one of the most overlooked aspects of Francis Bacon's paintings is his paintings of women. Sort of lost in history and the sacred monster myth is the fact that Bacon had many, many very close women friends. This particular one is the painter Isabelle Ross Thorne, and he portrays her here as a sort of commanding sort of Duchess of Soho, looking as if at her minions over there to her left over her shoulder. All the structure around here, one of Bacon's typical structure, sort of wire form structures, adds to her central importance in the painting. And behind her, a car is turning into a bull, yet another image of power. This really does emanate power. And I think it's one of, or at least I think it's one of the 10 best paintings Francis Bacon ever did. He went on to paint her about 15 more times. And this is George Dyer after the death of Peter Lacy. Tragically, at the end of Francis Bacon's first Tate retrospective, the very day a telegram came that Lacy died. The year after, George Dyer, who was a very, he was a Cockney thief who was very inept. The story was that he fell through the skylight of Bacon's studio, and then Bacon said, "Oh, have sex with me right away, I'm going to call the police." That was apocryphal. They met at an upscale homosexual bar, but poor George really was a fumbling, stumbling second-story man. But Bacon loved to dress him up. And so here they are out on the town. And Bacon also loved to paint him. And he could sit for hours.
This is a picture of George on a bicycle. John Russell particularly liked this painting, and he thought that George was, Russell did, was a kind of English everyman, and that that his profile, which could be on the prow of a ship, but also on a bicycle, captured something essential about the English working class. Next.
This is particularly relevant for France because one could argue that the apotheosis of Francis Bacon's career was when he had a retrospective at the Grand Palais in 1971. There were 134 paintings. Pablo Picasso had a retrospective there not many years before. Afterwards, there's this dinner for 500 people at Le Tremblay restaurant. There's Bacon sort of nodding and smiling and acknowledging all of his friends, while privately, the morning of this very day, George Dyer had taken an overdose of pills and alcohol in their shared hotel room. The manager of the hotel was asked to keep this quiet because otherwise it would overshadow this entire private view day. And the hotel manager obliged. But here is Bacon knowing that sort of shattering event, and he just went through with this entire evening as if nothing had happened. Next.
Bacon painted a series of triptychs after Dyer's death that are really a very rare and sort of profound meditation on death. Very rare in the 20th century to see something done like that. Again, I'll just keep myself to the middle image. That violet pool, you can see in the side images, Dyer is still alive. There's an organic color to the leaking. In the middle, he's taken on the shapeless form of death, which is not an artistic thing. And this violet pool. A violet is usually associated with flowers, fragrance, lovely things in France. In fact, here it is a symbol of death. Do I do this one, Annalyn? I guess so. This is Bacon with John Edwards, the last long and sustained relationship that he had. Edwards, like Dyer, was also a Cockney and a bit of a con man sometimes. Bacon liked that. Bacon didn't mind when people were trying to take advantage of him. He thought it was just an expression of the human nature, really. Next.
This is the other overlooked aspect of Bacon's painting. He was one of the great portraitists of the 20th century. And after everybody started dying and he bemoaned the fact that all of his subjects had died, he began painting many, many self-portraits. The one on the left, 1972, quiet, contemplative, very confident, assured brushstrokes, as if this figure is kind of vanishing into himself in contemplative thought. 1979, the one on the right, in contrast, is that of an aging queen. It is a quite frightening self-portrait, but Bacon always reflected in his self-portraits how he was feeling at the moment. In this one, his lipstick is smeared. He often wore makeup. Lipstick is smeared, and the sort of the pancake makeup is kind of spotty and ragged on his face. His eyes are bleary. It was all because of John Edwards in the previous photograph was distancing himself from Bacon. And so Bacon was a miserable, miserable old queen. That's what he was feeling in 1979 when this was painted. And here is Bacon. This is rather poignant. Towards the very end of his life, as John Edwards detached from him, Bacon met a very handsome, accomplished, and cultivated Madrileño named Jose Capello, and commenced traveling with Jose all around Europe, and of course, many times to Madrid and Sevilla and elsewhere. So here he is sitting at Le Coq, which was Bar Coq, which was their favorite bar that Jose had introduced him to in Madrid. And this is called the Last Martini. This was literally days before Bacon, on his last trip to Spain to see Jose, absolutely against his doctor's orders, he went, had this brief moment. They went out on the town, and then he wound up at the hospital, the Clinica Roubaix, where he died. He never made it back to England.
This is his last painting, and it's a painting that he almost certainly knew would be his last painting. He left it behind when he went to Madrid. And people often think of Bacon as an artist of screams and bloodshed, but he was also very often, as you saw in those portraits, an artist of whispers and dust and grays and careful tones. And here you see a bull, symbol of power, beginning to evaporate. And you see also that one of the bull's horns is in the form of a sickle, which is an ancient symbol of mortality, of course, in classical culture and in Christian culture too. So the matador is here saying goodbye to the ring. And with that, I think we can conclude.
Lovely, thank you so much. Elaine, let's go back to you.
Well, we could move this conversation in a dozen or 100 different directions, but I'm going to focus on one aspect that you raised so brilliantly in your presentation, which is Paris, Bacon's Paris. I didn't know about that Bacon had this extraordinary relationship with Paris, or that he not only learned how to speak French, but he learned how to write French, and he loved Paris and he loved France. And what you, if you'll allow me to just read one short passage from the book, Bacon had a history in Paris, of course, not just an affinity. He came to know the city during two magical moments, the late 1920s and the years just after the Second World War. Paris was where Bacon first dreamed of becoming an artist and where he first discovered Picasso's gift. Paris, though not part of the ancient world, had certain ancient seeming notes that appealed to him. Paris could be a place of origins and first principles, an Athens of modern art, with its philosophical spirit and sensual sweetness. Tell us about Bacon's Paris.
Well, I mean, a simple way to put it is that he never did that much work in France successfully. London was his reality, his soulmate, his wife. Paris was his dream and his, if you want to put it in that way, a kind of mistress and escape. Paris also represented for him, I think, another cultural edifice that that embraced him without reservation, unlike the English. Who there were always people saying, no, he's just grand guignol, he's not so great. But Paris loved Bacon, and Bacon, a very insecure man deep down, really appreciated that love, and it fortified him. He was a man who loved life, Bacon. Only a person filled with life could make such dark paintings. And Paris was his kind of light. Just think about the difference between a pub and a cafe. You have it right there, I think. They're both fabulous places, but they're very different.
Well, and also, as you just said, Mark, there was something intimidating for Bacon about the English intelligentsia. They had all, or virtually all of them, of course, had gone to public schools and then on to Oxbridge. And despite the fact that across the channel, the French, the Mandarins, were also wonderfully educated, but there was a sort of more generosity of spirit he found. And he also found validation in people like Michel Léry, because, these people were one heartbeat away from Picasso. It was Kahnweiler, the great dealer, and all of that world that he could sort of sink into on that side of the channel. And he would become the man who, he always had his bespoke suits. He saved them for Paris. He just loved that sense of going out to La Grande Velour, to hotels for these marvelous dinners. And that to him was a perfect balance against his life in London, which did tend to be around seamy Soho.
Well, and imagine what it would be like if you're an insecure man like Bacon and a painter who has made the kinds of pictures he's made, to be greatly admired by somebody like Michel Léry, a great Mandarin of the left bank, close connections to Picasso, one of the most beautiful flats in Paris, and a Maoist, which Bacon also always found amusing, that those left bank Mandarins would take such an interest in Mao. But to be admired by somebody like Léry meant to be, if you'd had no education, as Bacon had not had any education, meant that he was being recognized by a person who appreciated surrealism and originality in a very deep way. And I think it meant a great deal to him, apart from the sweetness of life that he found in Paris and in the south of France, to be recognized by that kind of person.
Was it also an evolution, though, because you write about his early time in Paris, in Montparnasse, for example, and you write that he was awed and frightened by Montparnasse. He never really embraced that whole Montparnasse exile community, and also was both obsessed and had a very complicated relationship with Picasso and Picasso's whole the Picasso myth in Paris.
Well, that's absolutely the case. You have to remember that when he was in Paris, he wasn't, he was so very young. And Montparnasse, he actually lived in a flat in Montparnasse. But just imagine at that time how intimidating all of the Picasso et al. Would have been for somebody that young. And Bacon, by then had spent 6 months with the Boccatin family learning French. So at least he was comfortable enough speaking the language, which was always very, very important to him. He loved the fact that he could speak French. And imagine, as we write in the book, being a young artist, virtually untrained, except for some drawing classes, and going around Montparnasse, where Kiki was swanning down one avenue, and Man Ray was around the corner, and Picasso was holding court. So that kind of pushed him in the direction of fashion and design. At that point in time, he did not feel comfortable in that sort of, as you said, Elaine, in that sort of artistic culture of France at the time. It was only later, when he had established himself, he'd had a retrospective at the Tate. Then he was coming into his own. And at that point, the French opened their arms to Bacon. They loved him.
When he was in Montparnasse, he was only 20 years old. I mean, a college student, right? And he had no education, no art education either, really. How was he possibly to become a painter? How was he to interact with Picasso or people like that? I mean, they were stars in a firmament well beyond his ken at that point. So he tried to erase, I mean, the glory, I mean, Montparnasse in the 1920s must be the most exciting scene ever, almost. And Bacon tried to erase it from his life because he was not part of that scene. He was interested in design and decoration at that point. And he really was, he was 19 and 20 years old.
I know I have to turn over the microphone to the audience, but I did want to raise something that I found that Annalyn gave a talk in 2013 on tricks of the trade, how biographies turn lives into art. And I just wanted to share it because for all of you out there, whoever thought about what is the key to writing a biography, Annalyn gave it to us. She said there were 4 absolutely critical points to keep in mind, at least back then, maybe it's changed now. Know everything, edit ruthlessly. Find the inner truth of your subject. Channel your inner novelist, that is, opened with a bang, end with a bit of poetry, and always be aware of the arc of the life. And then context is critical. Situate your subject within time and place. Are those still pretty good rules that guided you with the Bacon work?
I've got to say, I stand by that. My partner in crime over there, I'm sure will have something to say. But yes, the essential point, again, and I think we alluded to it earlier, is you want to write a biography that really does approximate a novel. You want to be sucked into the life in the same way. The biggest mistake I think most biographers make is just to go from fact to fact, you know, have some kind of structure, chronological structure, but there's nothing alive in the language, you know, that carry forward propulsion in the narrative. So, you know, way back in 2013, or actually way back before that, we sort of looked to, in particular, I looked to Richard Ellman's biography of Oscar Wilde. You know, Ellman was a wonderful biographer, James Joyce, and then Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde springs to mind because Bacon was always talked of as a Wildean figure. You know, so it's sort of a natural to channel that kind of Wildean sensibility that had existed in Oscar Wilde's own day into this book. But again, it's all about expanding outward from your subject, placing your subject in the context of the times, which is critical. You know, people forget, but history is not on everyone's fingertips anymore. And then have that narrative drive. That is so key.
Biography, I mean, there's not only one kind of biography to write. That's the kind of biography that we've written or tried to write, that has a strong narrative undertow, that has a novelistic quality, but is still true to the facts, and that has good language. I think the main thing, though, in any book is just not to be a bag of air or a collection of dead facts or a trunk in the attic. You have to figure out a way, one way or another, to bring the words and the life to life. It's a portrait painting. And there, as you all know from going to museums, there's plenty of dead portraits in there, deader than a doornail. You have to bring it to life. And you can do that in all kinds of ways. But that's the trick. Just don't drop a trunk on your toe or puff and puff and puff. All these great big books, of which we are guilty of too. Many of them are just bags of fact.
Well, what's so great about this book is that it's a page turner. You know, it's hard to believe that a 705-page biography can be a page turner, but there's something that you did, a technical little trick that you did, that the breakout. What you did is that you took works of art and you broke it out at ends of chapters, almost like an old news magazine sidebar, so that the reader could continue with the narrative and the novelistic quality and the drama of the story, but then get the art in digestible bits.
That's also an expression of modesty, because you really must not reduce the art to the life or the life to the art. So breaking the art apart a little bit puts some oxygen, some space between the life and the art, which is as it should be, because you're never going to get entirely to the bottom of why this person creates that painting. but you juxtapose them in a good and serious way, you get an intuition about these things. If you just drop them in the middle of the text, it becomes indigestible pudding, you know, I mean, that stops the narrative flow.
Well, it works.
I'm going to jump in now because we've had some questions in the chat, and I think they'll make for an interesting continued discussion. Elaine, thank you so much for your fantastic questions and for your amazing presence. It's so lovely to see you here. I'm going to remove your pin, and we'll focus on Annalyn and Mark, and we'll ask some questions in the chat that I've received in the chat. If you haven't yet posted your question, we have about 10 minutes, 15 minutes left. So please go ahead and post your question. And I will read them out to Annalyn and Mark. So we actually had two questions about the same subject. So both Alan and Robert want to know, did you end up liking bacon? That's what Alan asked. And Robert said, do you love your subject?
Go ahead, Annalyn.
Actually, we were a little nervous about this, actually, going in, because, you know, the stories, the stereotype of Bacon was so fierce, and just the sort of queenie side of Bacon, which everybody knew, you know, as well as the sacred monster. There was so much out there that in the end, it kind of hid the other Francis Bacon. So we were actually very relieved to early on in this project to find out that had eclipsed everything else. And in fact, without making Francis Bacon into a model gentleman citizen, which he wasn't, but he had many, many endearing traits. He was very loyal to his friends, as Mark always talks about that. He was exceedingly kind to his family. You know, he would be the person who would be writing letters to his women friends when they were having issues. So this entire other side of Francis Bacon began to emerge pretty early days in our reporting.
Yeah, I like him. I came to like him very much, really, for a number of reasons. One, he had such a sense of fun. I mean, you wouldn't think it if you look at the paintings necessarily, but he had a great sense of joy, fun, and you know, just élan. He was a marvelous company. He told good stories. He did outrageous things. He really lived life hard and in a full way. That's very attractive. And he was mostly nice. He was only rude unintentionally, as David Sylvester said. But the other thing that I came to admire him very much because he was very courageous. Freud said he was the most courageous and fearless person he'd ever met. And that took many, many forms. But the most important is that he really set the dark edge for art in the 20th century. I mean, he went there. He found a way to express certain frightening things that happened in the 20th century. He stripped away, not just the blood, but he had a way of stripping away the various things that people use to protect themselves, various cultural and social mannerisms or affects, religion being the most noteworthy, but many, many others too. So he was relentlessly trying to get to the kind of the bone and the nerve of experience. And that's not necessarily a fun thing to do, you know. You can have great fun at night, but that's what he was doing every single morning that he could. He was trying to actually get to some, you know, deep sensation about the darkness of the 20th century. He knew there was plenty of light too, but his subject was the darkness.
Do you think it wore on him?
Yes, I do. I mean, yes, his life was really actually quite regulated, almost like a soldier. He would work every morning and then he would misbehave madly every night, probably to work off the pressure. Annalyn likes to talk about how much he relied on alcohol and drugs. He was really pinned together pretty precariously.
Yes, I actually do want to elaborate on that for just a minute, because, you know, the fearless Bacon facade that everybody knows about, one of our very kind of surprising discoveries actually was how very early Francis Bacon began going to doctors and asking for all these kind of drugs that could get him through. I mean, everything from sedatives to psychotropics to, you know, one time he came back from Tangier and he was given intravenously by his doctor a very powerful sedative to calm him down. He always had to ratchet himself up so much to create and then he would try to come down and go back up and come down. And it was an intensely regulated process. Right. And whenever he was in London, he would go at least once a week to his doctor. So that kind of indicates the another side of Bacon that we were very interested in exploring.
He was both very ill from asthma, really. I mean, he had terrible physical problems that he was treating with drugs, but he was also, because of, of his life, his experiences in life, he was wound so tightly that he almost vibrated. He was one of those people who physically seemed to slightly tremble because he was wound so tightly. And he needed to discharge that, to relax it. I mean, he was exhausted, I think, mentally after the studio in the morning. And so then he would go to Soho.
But one interesting example, if you remember back to that 62 Crucifixion, the one where I said I couldn't even look at it on the wall, that was one of the rare instances where Bacon was in such a frenzy to finish that as a sort of the capstone of his 62 Tate retrospective. He painted while he was drunk. It was that's what he did for 2 weeks. He just painted and he was drunk.
He was just tippling while he was drinking. He wasn't fall down drunk.
Well, it was more than that. And I remember that John Rothenstein, who was the head of the Tate, said he was very concerned about Bacon at that point. But the point I was going to make was that he normally, he regulated his life so that he would go out and go drinking, but then he would come home even at 4 a.m. and he would be back up at 7 or 7:30 to work. He was so devoted to working. That was his life, that he would work through what the rest of us would be like a buffalo running over us. We couldn't possibly even get out of bed, but he did, which is such a fascinating look at this man. Work to him was everything.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something that Mark was saying, because it relates to a question that Audrey had asked in the chat about the violence that we see in his work. So Audrey wants to know, Bacon's works convey violence more powerfully than even the most graphic contemporary film, for example. Why do you think they remain so stirring and disturbing, even when we've grown accustomed to violence in the media? Maybe, Annalyn, we should start with you, since you're the one who feels, that you can't even look at the Crucifixion.
That's the only painting, I might add, that I had that feeling. But it's so visceral. I mean, the fact is, you have a figurative artist, at a time of abstract expressionism and then, minimalism and everything else. So he was dealing with these very issues on the canvas. And his idea was that man is meat, that runs throughout his career. So you have to, you never can quite see the beauty without seeing the violence. I guess that's how I would put it. So it's an issue. It is definitely an issue with Bacon's paintings.
I would answer that a little bit differently. Bacon himself always looked aghast when people said that there was violence in his art. He didn't think there was. He thought he was just showing the facts the way it was. So he did not think that he himself was doing this and to his figures. He was with his figures. That's one of the points we make in the book, that he's with the meat, he's sympathizing with the figure that has been so beset upon, so put upon by the world as it is in the 20th century. So he's not inflicting violence, he's suffering the violence of the world. That's how he would have looked at it. Also, the reason it's different and it lasts is because what artists do is they always give other artists their subject. Whatever the artists themselves, they always want to know how you do it, what the form is, what the color, the light, the structure. So Bacon, he's a very complicated artist in that regard because he's self-taught largely, and he makes a lot of bad painting. But his great paintings are formally brilliant. They have a relationship of color, line, the paint surface, all these different things that bring it to life and mean that you can't forget it. His figure doesn't look like any other figure in 20th century art, whether you like it or not. It sort of doesn't matter. It's there. He added a figure that we did not have before. And that's a remarkable thing. You can't forget that. Once you've seen a Bacon, you can never really get it out of your head. It's like a handwriting that you know, it's just there. And it wasn't there before. So I think, you know, it's not so much the violence, it's that he created a new kind of figure that was exposed to the difficulties of the 20th century. And that's unforgettable.
Okay, one final question, then we have a question that the library likes to ask all of our guests. This question comes from Connie, who, I'm paraphrasing here in the interest of time, asks broadly, who or what was his biggest influence?
Wait, was on him or his?
On him, yeah.
Well, you know, he always acknowledged. So, I mean, it was, the only person, I think Mark said this earlier, the only artist who he ever said unequivocally was the most important artist was Pablo Picasso. And then early on, of course, the Surrealists did play a role in influencing his painting. Mark, who else?
Well, Bacon was remarkably, like most self-taught characters and autodidacts, he was remarkably ungenerous. It was his one great weakness, I think. He was remarkably ungenerous about other artists. He thought, why are you painting flowers when there's an ambulance roaring outside your door? You can look at the ambulance, that's what's important. So he was very, very ungenerous, but he did take from a lot of artists. He looked around. The one he would really acknowledge, as Annalyn says, is Picasso. But, you know, he loved late Rembrandt. He loved Rembrandt's self-portraits. You can see that in his own self-portraits. And if you're talking about what was the most important influence in his life, well, it's the Anglo-Irish childhood and it's all its many complexities of isolation and animal. I mean, there's nothing more animal really than an Anglo-Irish household of the late 19th and early 20th century. It was horses, dogs, hunting, really.
And I want to throw one final curveball in here. Oddly enough, after when all was said and done, Bacon in his last decade and a half turned of all artists Ingres. So there's a period when he was actually painting several paintings that invoked Ingres by name. And people sort of scratch their heads. What? You know, Francis Bacon, you know, who looks like he came out of Soutine. But so he was, as Mark said, he was open to influences wherever he could find them. But I've always found that a sort of interesting side digression by Francis Bacon, who got tired of being told that he was just this, you know, Bron Guignol painter. So he said, I'll show him. I'll start taking some ideas from
Ingres. Ingres is also, he's one of those examples where people who aren't artists, they might like him or not. They might think he's sterile or breathless, or there's not enough oxygen, or sometimes goofy, or they might love him for the classical. In fact, what artists respond to in Ingres is yes, the color, but the madness of his line, really the extraordinary quality of that elongated line that Ingres has is if you're an artist, is just magical and remarkable and new and fresh. And so I think he was yes, as Annalyn says, he was saying, everybody's telling me what I am. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to look at this artist who's all about line. Bacon said he had very little to do with drawing or line. He was a Venetian, not a Florentine. And he was not Ingres kind of classical. And I'm going to be as still and silent as Ingres can be. And I think he's just challenging himself, really. He's playing with reputation and expectation.
Okay, one final question, briefly. What are you working on now? Are you allowed to say?
You know, the long and short answer is, of course, there are people out there that interest us, but are you kidding? Once you write one of these books, then you have to, help your baby. And so there's lots of after these kinds of wonderful conversations we're having, where you get to talk about this book. So give us a little time, please. We'll be back shortly.
I've added Elaine here because Elaine's nodding.
Well, because it's the question authors absolutely hate, and that is the perfect answer, Annalyn. Are you kidding? We're going to celebrate this book, and we're going to celebrate it in Paris, because if I can reveal a scoop, it's going to be translated into French. And so we're going to have a great party and a great celebration with lots of champagne in Paris, as
You know,
the library loves to do.
I'm a glass half empty person, so I don't know that I will be also that cheerful. Somebody once said that Annalyn is one of those glass half full people who ordinarily I just think, ugh, because I'm glass half empty. And
actually, Elaine will appreciate this. The person who compared Mark and me as a glass half full me and Mark half empty was none other than Henry Grunwald. Henry Grunwald was the great editor at Time Inc., first the editor of Time magazine and then of the Empire. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. And he was giving us a book party for our first book. And he said that, and it really reflects Mark's and my ways of looking at life.
It's why the marriage works.
And by the way, Bacon was both those things.